Thank you, John. Sorry. Before I go any further, hello everyone. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the other authors of the report. James Darcy, of course, co-author of the report, who is currently on his way to the Philippines to do an RTE, and so couldn't be with us today, but is practicing what we preach in the report, I hope. And also the very large number of, as John mentioned earlier, the very large number of ALNAP members and other humanitarians who have contributed their thinking and their experience of quite a wide variety of different approaches to gathering and using evidence. And hopefully we've done justice to the tremendous amount of work that's going on out there. What we're going to look at today, really these 5 areas. What is evidence and why does it matter? How can we judge the quality of that evidence? How good, when we judge the quality of that evidence, how's it coming up? How good do we think the evidence currently available is? Then moving on to utilization, how can we ensure that evidence is used in humanitarian decision making? And finally, a short piece just on what the ALNAP network is doing about these various things. So, with no more ado, what do we mean by evidence and why does it matter? In the paper, the definition, the broad definition that we've used of evidence is that it's a very specific type of information. It's information which helps to prove or disprove a specific proposition. So evidence is information which can be used either to move towards proof or away from the proof of a proposition that's been made. And that idea is quite important, and we'll come back to it, if we may, in a minute. Why does it matter? I mean, this is slightly teaching grandmothers to suck eggs, but I think it is worth just sort of saying, just for the record, 3 reasons, and a lot of this paper is based on discussions that happened in Washington at the ALNAP annual meeting last year. And this was quite an important element of that discussion among the ALNAP network. 3 reasons. First of all, because if you don't know stuff, if you don't know where, who, what, then obviously any form of intervention is just going to be less effective. That evidence is a significant input to humanitarian responses in the same way that other inputs, such as logistics capacity or food aid, are significant inputs. It's something you need to do the job. Secondly, because if we follow the code of conduct and principles of humanitarianism, and we are attempting to provide aid on the basis of need alone, we're attempting to be impartial, for example, then you need to know what the need is in order to be able to do that. The availability of evidence is a fundamental building block to ethical, values-led humanitarian intervention. And this was a point which came out very, very strongly in the meeting in Washington, and Peter Walker has written and spoken about this, including on the ALNAP website, which the page that speaks to today's meeting. Finally, of course, without evidence, you can't hope to be accountable. You can't hope to account for the way that resources have been used. Who got what where. How were those choices and decisions made? So, whilst it might appear to be a fairly dry topic in some ways, although it did get everyone out here, so thank you very much on a Friday afternoon. It's actually fundamental. We would suggest that the issue of evidence is fundamental to the success of the humanitarian enterprise. Now let's go back to those propositions. In humanitarian action, generally, we would suggest that there's 2 broad kinds of propositions which evidence is being collected and utilized in addressing. And they, imaginatively, we've called Proposition A and Proposition B. Proposition A is about need, and it's generally the proposition that, in a specific context, there is a situation of humanitarian need, and that the situation is such that external assistance is required. The second part of that proposition is not always as explicit as it might be. So this is the sort of area, obviously this is largely an area which is addressed by needs assessment, early warning and needs assessment. Generally, the propositions around need tend to find their form in those areas. The second proposition is the what do we do about it one. So proposition B, which is that in this situation of need, which requires external assistance, certain sorts of action are likely to be effective in decreasing the need. So that, if you like, is a proposition which underpins response choice and program planning. And retrospectively, of course, this is also a key proposition for evaluation, and therefore of particular interest to ALNAP, because what you're doing in evaluation is talking about the degree to which certain kinds of inputs or certain kind of responses were effective in addressing the needs. So these broad propositions, we would suggest, underpin a very large amount of the evidence that is collected as part of the standard program cycle of humanitarian response. And I should just make a caveat there about the report, that really what we were looking at here was very much evidence which is collected as part of the program cycle. I mean, if you look at this sort of generic program cycle of response, several of those stages are driven largely by the desire to collect evidence. So you have early warning, assessment, monitoring, and evaluation, which together form the largest number of dots on the cycle, if you like. All of these are about the collection and analysis of operational evidence. And this is what we were really looking at. This kind of operational level is what we were looking at in the report. We weren't looking so much at formal research. So this is much more about the sort of evidence that is collected routinely by humanitarian organizations. So, if evidence is information that is generally trying to work towards the proof or disproof of one of these propositions, how do we know if it's any good? Well, there are a lot of different schema for addressing evidence quality. And looking at them, we noted that there were a lot of them. We noted also that they tended to orient either towards qualitative or quantitative evidence, but few of them seemed to were broad enough to address both in kind of one list, if you like. And that also often they are very rightly, the existing schema are very specific to a particular area of academic endeavour, and that terminology that is used in one is used in another one in a different way. And so what we did was we suggested a broad categorisation of criteria for evidence quality, which we hope covers the biggest issues in humanitarian evidence, operational evidence, and which we hope is generally acceptable. And it is really these 6 criteria you have on the screen here. To explain them a little bit, if one thinks of a situation, a shelter situation, for example, where either people involved in the humanitarian response are doing some form of assessment and they want to know if there is need, so proposition A, they might be looking at the proportion or the number of houses which had 40% or 50% damage, for example. And you might want to know what proportion of houses are like that. Or if you're looking at protection, it could be the number of incidences of violence or threats of violence in a population. Or if you're looking at food security, it could be something like the number of meals that a household has had. All of these things have been used as indicators in assessment and also evaluation in the past. If you take one of those things, and you look at a report that is based around it, well, first of all, one would want to think about the accuracy of that. So say we've gone out, and we've tried to identify in an area how many houses have been damaged. Yeah? We'll either get that right or we'll get it wrong. Maybe we're doing it quickly. Maybe we're the building density is so high that we can't actually get a very good number, and we say 60%, but actually the reality is it's 30%. Yeah? So the first criteria is basically, is it accurate, the information that we're collecting? Does it faithfully mirror the conditions on the ground? But then you have to ask, even if it's accurate, is it representative? Because we're probably not going to look at every single building in Port-au-Prince or talk to every single household. And so to what degree are the buildings that we looked at or the households that we talked to representative of the larger population of concern? And obviously there are statistical methods to address this question, but often they're not used for a variety of reasons. So we need other methods to look at representativeness. Thirdly, relevance. This is particularly an issue for indicators, and maybe it's something we'll come back to. How do we know that a building that is 40% damaged, say, is a building that can't be lived in? How do we know that the indicator that we've selected actually really indicates the thing that we want to know about? And in the selection of indicators, very often this is a very big problem, as those of us who've been involved in this know. Moving on, and this is more, the first three criteria are fairly generic to most of those parts of the evidence cycle. Attribution is a particular problem for evaluation, of course, because there, say we had a needs assessment, we decided that a certain number of people felt or had been felt that aggressed or had suffered aggression. And we went in and did some form of program, and then we went back 6 months later and the number was much lower. Yeah? The problem with attribution, of course, is how do we actually make a link between the intervention that we made, the program that we made, and the fact that the situation on the ground has changed. And this is a core problem for evaluators. You know, things are different, but is the difference a result of the intervention that we made? Moving on, the fifth criterion is generalizability. Not always an issue, but if one wishes to take evidence from a particular situation and extrapolate it for policy purposes very often, to create policy on the basis of that evidence, how much is something that is true in Afghanistan also going to be true in Zimbabwe? How much do we know that we can generalize from the evidence base that we have? And finally, the sixth criterion, and one which wasn't in our initial proposal to the ALNAP meeting, but came through very strongly from the meeting, is this one about the clarity of concepts and methods. And I think this one's really important. First of all, how do you know that those other 5 criteria have been met? If you're reading needs assessment reports or evaluations that do not tell you how the research or how the field staff went about dealing with those issues. If you don't have a clear statement of methodology, if you don't have clarity around the methodology that was used and the limitations to the methodology used, and very often reports don't have these, then you can't actually answer any of the other questions. But perhaps more importantly, go back to the idea of propositions, if you will, for a minute. Evidence is not neutral. Evidence is not information. It's information that's related to a particular proposition. And someone has made that proposition for the purposes, for some form of purpose. Yeah? Often there is a temptation to read reports as if they are neutral descriptions of a situation. Yeah? Now, if the report does not say what question it is there to answer and who asked the question, there is, of course, a temptation to think that this thing is just a true description of the way things are in Port-au-Prince or Kabul or wherever, when, of course, it's not. Someone asked that question for a reason. And what we see very often, of course, is that the people who are asking the questions and the questions that are being asked by international humanitarian actors. Yeah? If one were to ask the affected population, you might find they would ask different questions. Yeah? And so none of this is neutral. And being clear about, we felt, and the meeting felt, that being clear about who is asking the question and why is extremely important. Let me give you just one tangible example, because I feel I haven't been very clear around that. and this is changing, but many of the needs assessments that one looks at from over the past decade, the questions that were asked and the way the needs assessment's written, many, not all, suggest a priori that there is a need for international support, international humanitarian response, because that was the assumption in the question. The question was not, what are the local capacities and are they able to address this situation? The question was, what do we need to provide? And obviously, those two different questions will give you very different answers. So the ALNAP meeting felt that this was a very important point, which is why I've laboured it a little. Moving on to the programme cycle, how good then is the evidence that we currently work on? And where are the challenges? Well, the challenges differ slightly at different elements, different points of the programme cycle. Early warning, the big challenge, of course, is relevance. It's indicators, particularly where you're providing early warning of complex economic and social processes like food insecurity or famine. What indicator is going to reliably tell you 6 months in advance, or what combination of indicators is going to tell you how things are going to unfold down the line? With assessments, the challenge is often around accuracy. Actually, we don't really know if the challenge is around accuracy. What we know is that they often don't explain the methodology, so it's very difficult to identify how accurate, how they, for example, triangulated information. What was in and what was out. At what point was information discarded because it was not likely to be accurate. Another problem with assessments is because they're often being done fairly rapidly, they will tend to use convenient samples very often, kind of by the side of the road out of the Land Cruiser kind of samples, which are not necessarily representative of the entire population. Monitoring, one thing that tends to come up in many monitoring systems, or two things. One is that they are fairly short term. We seem to have not, as a system, done a very good job, even in situations where humanitarians have been engaged year on year for over a decade, of setting up mechanisms that collect the same data set over time. Kind of it finishes after a year or someone changes the indicators. So actually knowing what is going on in terms of the relationship between the response and need over time is a real weakness. Another problem, one I think we're all aware, is that there is a tendency, a relevance problem here, a tendency often to focus on outputs, number of wells dug, rather than, in the monitoring systems, the degree to which those outputs led to changes in the level of need. And so the sort of things that are being monitored are not necessarily relevant to the question, are we making a difference? And in evaluations, all of the above applies. But they also, as we said earlier, have the particular problem of attribution, of knowing whether we see a change, but it's very difficult to attribute the change to the inputs. And also, in some cases, of course, issues of generalizability. How does one use evaluations? This problem we have in ALNAP when we're doing our lessons papers. How do you use evaluations to say something that is bigger than the specific response itself? So what can we do about this? Well, it's not rocket science, and happily, much of this is being done already. But it's probably worth underlining. None of these problems are unique to humanitarian action. Most, indeed, probably all of these problems have been addressed, particularly in many cases by social scientists working in other areas. So working with academics on some of these methodology issues is an obvious win. And it's a win which many ALNAP members and others, ACF, Oxfam, IRC, have been doing over the last few years. Thinking about the importance of evidence and how much money, how much are we investing in this relative to the potential impact? If we go back to the point that if we don't know what's going on, we're highly unlikely to be successful in a response. Are we really spending enough? I think a good example of this is around RCTs, where they are extremely expensive. But talking to some of the agencies who've done randomized control trials, they say, well, yes, they are expensive, But what's the cost of not knowing some of these things? And I think that question is always a useful one. What is the cost of not knowing? Thirdly, collaboration. System-wide thinking about evidence rather than sort of siloed thinking about evidence. Looking at what the gaps are. CALP, for example, has just, some of you will have seen, has just done a sort of system-wide looking at what the evidential gaps are around cash. Sharing results, you know, blowing our own trumpet a little bit, the ALNAP ERD that John was talking about. And making results available so that people can critique each other's findings. The point about building evidence over time so that it's not just one-year cycles. And also addressing the systematic exclusion. Who is creating the evidence for whom? You know, it seems that people on the receiving end of aid, or people who are not receiving aid but are in crisis situations, are very seldom calling the shots about the information that should be collected or the information that is provided. Moving briefly on to the issue of use. I think charitably, one might say that in humanitarian response, the use of evidence from early warning, assessment, monitoring, and evaluation is inconsistent. Actually, it's when one looks at the organisations that have tried to track their use of for example, evaluative information, it's perhaps unsurprising to see actually the use is quite high in an instrumental sort of sense, you know, but it's high to the degree that the evidence suggests doing things that aren't particularly difficult to do. Yeah? So if you want your evidence to get used, cynically one might say, make sure that it points to something that's fairly easy to do, non-controversial, doesn't rock the boat. Yeah? Evidence that doesn't fulfill those criteria finds it much harder to get used. The second thing we should just be aware of when we're thinking about use is what do we mean by use? This system is not a machine, you know. It's not something where you kind of put information in and a magical solution will appear. We should probably not be thinking of the use of evidence as a mechanistic, simple thing to do. Decision makers will often have evidence which points, good evidence, accurate, relevant, generalizable evidence that points in completely different directions, because they will be having to make decisions around, for example, should we do this thing? On the one hand, the evidence suggests it's not the thing that is most relevant, using the OECD DAC criterion of relevance. Yeah? It's not the thing that if we asked people, they would want something else. Yeah? So, no, we shouldn't. But on the other hand, according to the criterion of effectiveness, it's going to be fast. Yeah? Now, you can have two really good sets of evidence that say it's going to be fast, but it's not the ideal thing that people would want. That's still going to be a judgment. The evidence is not going to make the decisions for us, but it should inform the decisions. Having said that, there's probably quite a lot that could be done to improve the use of evidence, and is, again, in some cases being done. Making it accessible, sharing it, making it easy to get at, making it readable. People do not have vast amounts of time often to make these decisions. Making it available at the right time. An assessment that comes in after the decision has been made can be of the best quality, but it's just too late. Disseminating evidence through different media. One thing that we found is that where controversial or difficult evidence has been accepted into humanitarian practice, it seems to be partly because, as we see in this room today, humanitarianism is a fairly social, the creation of knowledge is fairly social. It's not this is still not a huge field of practice. Many people know each other, yeah? And evidence is knowledge is socially constructed. So if you want to change the knowledge, change the assumptions, change the bases, you need to change the conversation. This point, of course, has great significance for the degree to which crisis-affected people are able to address the evidence if they're not part of the club. But that might be something we come back to. Decision makers can ensure that there are explicit requirements for evidence in the process. In fact, decision makers could ensure, in many cases, there are explicit processes for making decisions. One thing that comes out of HPG's work and the work of Oxfam and Save the Children around the situation in South Central Somalia a couple of years ago is that there did not seem to be an articulation between early warning information and any process of making decisions. So if you don't have a decision-making process, you're not going to get a decision. But then having clear points where evidence goes into that process is useful. Incentivizing the use of evidence in decision-making in a variety of ways, making that the norm in an organisation, rewarding that in organisations. And, of course, allowing programmes to change on the basis of evidence. It's not much good knowing what's going on and what should be different if you have structured a programme in such a way that you can't change it. Finally, what is the ALNAP network doing about it? Well, a variety of things following that meeting. We have the EHA, the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action Guidance, that's being piloted at the moment, in which we're trying to place a much more emphasis on the quality of evaluative evidence. We also have communities of practice looking at this issue. You're very welcome to join. See the website for more details. The ALNAP Resource Library, it has 1,000-something evaluations, as John noted. It has over 5,000 documents, including the evaluations, about learning from humanitarian response. We're working to make it more searchable so that evidence is more available. Continuing to experiment with varied approaches in our research, we're using a variety of approaches, structured reviews of literature, statistical approaches to analysing questionnaire information in our leadership work, a rather exciting case-based approach that we used around beneficiary feedback. So we can share these among the membership and sort of see what works, what's possible, because often our sense is a lot more is possible than we do. And working to better understand how decisions get made and how risk is avoided. I have gone over time, for which I apologise, but thank you very much. If you want to know more about this, and also see some other people talking find more documentation on these issues, and also see other people talking about the issue of evidence and humanitarian action, I believe including Joe, Peter Walker, and others, please go to this area of the ALNAP website where we have more resources available. Thank you.